Ever feel like you're constantly being told to level up? Be happier, be healthier, make more money, be more successful. It's like this never-ending pressure to be better, do better, have more. But then you come across something like the material we're diving into today, and it kind of flips the script.
Yeah, it's like a breath of fresh air, isn't it? Because instead of piling on more things to worry about, more goals to chase, Mark Manson's book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck, which, by the way, we're exploring based on that YouTube transcript you sent, actually suggests we do some, subtracting. We need to figure out what to let go of, what to just not care about.
Exactly. And I bet that resonates with you listening out there. You've probably tried all the self-help hacks, the positive affirmations, the productivity tips. But this isn't about adding more to your plate. This is about being more strategic with your attention and energy, your, as Manson calls them, ferks.
It's not apathy. It's about being discerning, choosing where you direct your energy. And it pushes back against this overwhelming pressure to be positive all the time. The kind of pressure that ironically can make you feel even worse.
Oh, for sure. It's like the more you're told to be happy, the more you become aware of all the ways you're not. You see everyone else's perfectly curated lives on social media and think, well, I should be making more money, or maybe I need to try that new meditation app.
And you end up chasing this elusive feeling of enough. But Manson just cuts through all that noise. And he starts with this really interesting concept he calls the backwards law.
The backwards law, huh? I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
It's a bit of a mind bender. He basically says that the more you desperately want something, the more aware you become of its absence in your life. So the harder you try to force happiness, for example, the more acutely you feel unhappy.
So it's like the more you chase something, the further away it gets?
Exactly. It's like that Alan Watts idea about how the more you grasp at something, the more it slips through your fingers. And Manson, he actually uses this really vivid analogy to illustrate this. He talks about being on LSD and feeling like he was trying to walk towards a house, but the harder he tried, the further away the house seemed to get.
Wow. Okay. That's trippy.
Yeah.
But it makes sense, doesn't it? The more you focus on what you lack, the more you feel that lack.
Right. And he takes it a step further with this idea of the feedback loop from hell.
Oh, yeah. I remember that from the transcript. That sounded pretty rough.
Well, it's basically this spiral of negative emotions feeding off each other. It's when you start getting anxious about being anxious, or angry about being angry, or feeling guilty about feeling guilty.
It's like you're punishing yourself for having normal human emotions.
Exactly. It's like, oh, I'm so stressed, and then I'm so pathetic for being so stressed, and it just keeps going. But this is where Manson's idea of not giving a feck comes in.
So how does not giving a feck help with that?
Because it's about acceptance. It's saying, okay, things are messed up right now, I'm feeling stressed, and that's okay. It's about letting go of that second layer of judgment.
So it's not about suppressing your emotions or pretending everything's fine. It's about acknowledging them without making them worse.
Right. And this ties into his critique of what he calls how to be happy stuff.
What's the problem with wanting to be happy, though? Isn't that what everyone wants?
Of course, we all want to be happy. But Manson argues that the constant bombardment of positive messages, especially on social media, can actually make us feel worse. We're constantly comparing ourselves to these idealized versions of others. And it creates this feeling of inadequacy.
It's like everyone's showcasing their highlight reel and we're stuck watching our own blooper reel on repeat.
Exactly. And that's why, according to Manson, not giving a feck is actually a subtle art. It's not about being indifferent or apathetic. It's about choosing your battles, choosing what truly matters. And the first subtlety he talks about is this. Not giving a feck does not mean being indifferent.
Okay, I think a lot of people get that wrong.
They do. True indifference, according to Manson, is actually a form of caring too much. He says it's often a defense mechanism. People who appear indifferent are often deeply insecure and afraid of judgment, so they put up this wall of not caring at all.
So it's less about being strong and independent and more about being scared of what others think.
Often, yeah. But Manson says the thing is, as humans, we're wired to care about something. It's just a question of what we choose to care about. And that brings us to subtlety number 2. To not give a feck about adversity, you must first give a feck about something more important than adversity.
I like that. It reminds me of that story Manson tells about the elderly woman having a complete meltdown over a 30-cent coupon.
Yeah, that's a great example. The way he describes it, her reaction was so intense that it felt like those coupons were the most important thing in her world.
It's kind of sad when you think about it. Like, if those coupons are the biggest source of stress in your life, maybe you need to find something more meaningful to focus on.
Exactly. And that's Manson's point. He argues that finding something truly important and meaningful is the key to not getting bogged down by all the little annoyances of life.
So it's not about ignoring problems altogether. It's about having something bigger, something more important to focus on. What about that third subtlety?
Ah, yes. It's this. Whether you realize it or not, you are always choosing what to give a feck about.
We're always making choices, even when we're not aware of it.
Right. As kids, we pretty much give a feck about everything. But as we mature, we learn to be more selective. We figure out what's truly important to us and what we can let go of.
It's like we develop an internal filter for what deserves our attention and energy.
And often, that filtering process leads us to prioritize things like close relationships, meaningful work, and experiences that bring us joy. And those become the things that are truly fick-worthy in our lives.
And then, of course, we have that whole chapter about how happiness is a problem.
Right. And that's where Manson delves into some deeper philosophical stuff, starting with the story of the Buddha.
I remember that. The Buddha was living this life of luxury and ease, but he wasn't truly happy. And then he ventures out into the world, sees suffering for the first time, and it kind of shakes him to his core.
Yeah, and that realization leads him to the central tenet of Buddhism, which is that suffering is an inherent part of life.
It's not something to be avoided at all costs. It's something to be accepted and even embraced.
Exactly. And Manson uses this story to challenge the modern idea that happiness is some sort of formula you can just follow. Like if you just achieve X, Y, and Z, then you'll be happy. He says it's not that simple. And to drive that point home, he even uses this funny character he calls Disappointment Panda.
Oh, yeah. What was that all about again?
Disappointment Panda is basically this blunt, no-nonsense character who tells it like it is. He says things like, life is hard and you're going to die someday, and making a lot of money won't make you a good person.
So he's basically the anti-self-help guru.
Yeah, pretty much. But it's all about bringing us back down to earth and reminding us that happiness isn't about avoiding all the difficult stuff. And that ties into his idea that emotions are often overrated.
How so? I mean, emotions are a big part of being human, aren't they?
They are. But Manson argues that we shouldn't let them control us. He says that emotions evolved to help us survive and reproduce, not to be the sole drivers of our decisions.
So it's not about ignoring our emotions, but about understanding where they come from and not letting them dictate our every move.
Right. He even compares people who are overly controlled by their emotions to 3-year-old kids and dogs.
Ouch. I guess that's not exactly a compliment.
Not really. But the point is that we have the capacity to be more rational than that. We can acknowledge our emotions without letting them run the show. And he also talks about the hedonic treadmill and how our happiness levels tend to revert back to a baseline, even after major life changes.
It's like we get used to things, we achieve a goal, and we feel good for a while, but then we adjust, and we need something new to feel happy again.
Exactly. And that's why Manson says the real question is, what pain do you want in your life? What are you willing to struggle for?
I like that. Because we all want the good stuff, but we often don't want to put in the work. We want the six-pack abs, but we don't want to go to the gym. We want the loving relationship, but we don't want to have the tough conversations.
And that's where we need to be honest with ourselves about what we're truly willing to sacrifice. Because happiness, according to Manson, isn't about avoiding pain. It's about choosing the right kind of pain.
Choosing your struggles, as he puts it. So how does that relate to his idea that entitlement is not happiness?
Well, he defines entitlement as this need to constantly feel good about yourself, regardless of whether you've actually done anything to earn it. And he says there are 2 types of entitlement, the I'm awesome kind and the I'm a victim kind.
Interesting. So whether you have an inflated ego or a constant need for pity, it's still entitlement.
Yeah, and both stem from this self-centered perspective where you're always the main character and everyone else is just a supporting actor in your story.
And that leads to all sorts of problems, right? Like blaming others for your failures and taking all the credit for your successes.
Exactly. It's this fragile ego that's constantly demanding validation. And that's why Manson argues for the value of mediocrity.
Wait, the value of mediocrity, isn't that a bad thing?
Not necessarily. Manson says that our culture is obsessed with being exceptional, with always striving for greatness. But he thinks that embracing the idea of being average can actually be liberating.
Because it takes the pressure off. You don't have to be the best at everything. You can just be you.
Right. And he uses this analogy of the Big Mac. He says that all these messages telling us to be amazing are like Big Macs. They feel good in the moment, but they're not actually good for us.
So we need to focus on the vegetables of life.
Exactly. The mundane, everyday things that might not be glamorous, but that are actually good for us in the long run.
It's like finding satisfaction in the ordinary rather than constantly chasing the extraordinary. And that's where the self-awareness onion comes in, right?
Yeah. Manson describes self-awareness as having 3 layers. The first layer is simply understanding your emotions. The second layer is asking why you feel those emotions. But the deepest layer, the core of the onion, is identifying your values.
And that's where the real work is, because it forces you to confront what truly matters to you.
Exactly. And it's not always easy. It's often easier to blame other people or circumstances for our unhappiness than to look inward and examine our own values. But that's the key to living a fulfilling life.
Because our values shape our choices, our actions, and ultimately our experiences. So how do we know if we're living by shitty values versus good values?
Well, Manson says shitty values are things like prioritizing pleasure above all else, chasing material success, always needing to be right, and demanding constant positivity. And he calls them shitty values because they're ultimately unsustainable.
They don't lead to lasting happiness.
Right. And good values, on the other hand, are things like honesty, integrity, compassion, and self-respect. They're values that are rooted in reality, that are socially constructive, and that are within our control.
So it's about choosing values that will support our well-being and contribute to a better world. And then, of course, there's the whole idea that we're always choosing, even when we don't think we are.
Right, right. Manson uses this analogy of running a marathon. He says that the same physical experience, the pain, the exhaustion, can be interpreted in completely different ways, depending on whether you're choosing to do it.
It's like if you're forced to run a marathon, it's going to feel like torture. But if you choose to run it, it can be this empowering experience.
Exactly. And that applies to all areas of life. We're always choosing what to give a feck about, even when we're not consciously aware of it. And then he talks about how we're wrong about everything.
You mean like how we all have beliefs that turn out to be false?
Exactly. And he gives all of these examples from his own life and from history to show just how often we get things wrong. He even talks about the case of Meredith Marin, who was falsely convicted of murder based on a repressed memory that turned out to be completely fabricated.
Wow, that's terrifying. It really shows how unreliable our memories can be.
Right. And Manson's point is that we need to be more skeptical of our own beliefs. We need to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong about things. And that leads into his law of avoidance, which states that the more something threatens your identity, the more you'll avoid it.
So it's not just about avoiding negative experiences, it's also about avoiding positive experiences that might challenge how we see ourselves.
Exactly. It's like if you've always thought of yourself as a certain type of person, and then something comes along that challenges that perception, you might resist it even if it's a good thing.
We can get really attached to our own self-image, even if it's not serving us.
Yeah, and that's why Manson encourages us to be more flexible in how we define ourselves. He says that the more rigid our self-image is, the more limited we'll be in terms of what we can achieve. And then, of course, there's the whole chapter about how failure is the way forward.
I think that's something a lot of people struggle with.
It is. But Manson argues that our fear of failure often stems from having the wrong values. He says that if we're too focused on external validation, then failure will always feel like a threat.
Because it means we're not good enough in the eyes of others.
Exactly. But if we shift our focus to internal validation, to the process of growth and learning, then failure becomes just another step on the journey. And he even talks about how pain can be a sign of growth.
It's like that saying, no pain, no gain.
Right. He even mentions this psychological theory called positive disintegration, which suggests that periods of emotional distress can actually be catalysts for personal growth. And he encourages us to embrace those challenges, to lean into the discomfort, because that's where the real transformation happens.
And then he talks about the importance of saying no.
Yeah, Manson says that saying no is essential for setting boundaries and protecting our time and energy. And he contrasts Western culture, which is generally very positive and optimistic, with Russian culture, which places a higher value on honesty, even if it's negative.
So it's okay to say no to things that we don't want to do or that don't align with our values.
Absolutely. It's not about being rude or negative. It's about being assertive and standing up for yourself. And he also talks about the paradox of choice and how having too many options can actually make us less happy.
It's like when you go to a restaurant with a huge menu and you end up feeling overwhelmed and can't decide what to order.
Exactly. Sometimes having fewer choices can actually make us more satisfied. And that brings us to the last chapter, which is about contemplating your own mortality.
Yeah, that's a heavy one.
It is. But Manson argues that facing our mortality can actually be a liberating experience. He says that it helps us put things in perspective and realize what truly matters.
It's like when you're faced with the fact that you're going to die someday, all the little things that used to bother you suddenly seem insignificant.
Exactly. And Manson shares his own experience of dealing with the death of a friend and how it changed his outlook on life. He also talks about Ernest Becker's work on the denial of death and how it shapes so much of human behavior. And ultimately, he argues that the best way to deal with the fear of death is to find something bigger than yourself to care about.
Something that gives your life meaning and purpose.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck. So, for you listening out there, what are some of the things you've been giving a feck about that maybe you shouldn't be? And what are some of the things you're not giving a feck about that maybe you should be? Because ultimately, it's about choosing your fecks wisely.
And it's about realizing that you have the power to choose. Thanks for joining us on this journey. I'll catch you next time.